Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less academic and a lot more ancient, a long drift into the soft golden glow of early civilization, where the river was more than water and the wind carried the breath of gods. Welcome to ancient Egypt. But trust me, things weren't always pharaohs and pyramids. Before the grandeur, before the gold, it was just earth, sky, and the Nile. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Thousands of years ago, long before the pyramids stretched their limestone bones toward the stars, there was only a river and the people who lived by its rhythm. The Nile flowed like a clock made of mud and memory, flooding and retreating with such devotion that early Egyptians came to believe it breathed with divine purpose. The fertile black silt it left behind was more than soil, it was promise. Along its banks, scattered communities slowly stirred, like dew forming on papyrus reeds. They built with mudbrick, worshipped the sky, and watched the stars especially. Sirius, whose rising foretold the great flood.
Ow.
These people farmed barley and emmer wheat, fished from papyrus canoes, and traded with distant tribes.
Ow.
But they were not yet Egypt. Not truly. In the south, a culture rose called Nakadits. Artisans carved ivory combs and painted pottery in swirling red ochre designs. In the north, villages closer to the delta grew barley in square plots and worshipped bee gods and fish spirits. Over centuries, two lands began to take shape. Upper Egypt, ruled by fierce desert kings, and Lower Egypt, lush and humid near the sea. They spoke differently, dressed differently, even buried their dead in different directions. But they were slowly drifting toward each other, like twin branches of the same river. One legend tells of a ruler named Scorpion, yes, Scorpion, who left behind a ceremonial mace head showing him striking down his enemies. Another tells of Narmer, or perhaps Menes, the man said to have unified the two lands under one crown. No one knows exactly who he was, or if he was one man at all. What matters more is that the unification happened. Sometime around 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt merged. The Nile Valley became a single kingdom, guided by a divine king, the Pharaoh. And with that, history took a deep breath. The first dynasties emerged with quiet thunder. Temples rose, like fingers pointing toward the heavens. Hieroglyphs bloomed on stone like sacred graffiti. The calendar was born, not just to track days, but to know when to plant, when to pray, when to wait. And all of it spun around the river, like threads around a spindle. Even death had its place in this order. The early Egyptians believed that to die was simply to journey. Their tombs were not endings, but carefully prepared waiting rooms for the afterlife. Bodies were wrapped, goods were packed, and the soul was whispered across the threshold with ritual and reverence. The spirit would face judgment, weighing its heart against a feather, and if found pure, would pass into the field of reeds. Paradise not unlike the life they had, but perfect. This belief gave their lives a calm certainty. Build, plant, worship, die, and be remembered. It was in this patient, deliberate way that the first dynasty laid its foundations. Narmer's successors, Horha and Jor, extended control across the land. Trade routes opened like veins lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia. Meanwhile, new cities grew like brush fire in the desert. Abydos became the spiritual heart, where kings were buried in long rows of brick tombs. In each generation, the pharaoh was not merely ruler, but living God. The people did not serve him because they were afraid. They served him because he anchored the universe. He was the balance, the mat. Without him, the sun might not rise. This belief created something rare, a civilization where change came, slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. For hundreds of years, Egypt expanded its rituals, codified its myths, and perfected its divine order. And though the monuments of this age were humble compared to the pyramids that would follow, they held something more precious beginnings. In their tombs and tools, we see the outlines of eternity starting to take shape. These were not yet the Egypt of stone giants and golden coffins, but they were its dreamers, laying down bricks and mud, in silence, under stars that never stopped watching. And so, the Nile whispered, as it always had, and Egypt listened. That is where we begin. After the dust and disarray of the first intermediate period, Egypt did not simply awaken, it exhaled, long and low, like the breath of the Nile returning to its proper rhythm. The land had waited, its temples cracked, and its granaries hollow, but it had not forgotten. And neither had the gods, at least so the people hoped. With the rise of Mentuhotep II of Thebes, a ruler whose name meant the god Montu is satisfied, came the slow and deliberate stitching together of a divided nation. He wore the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, not just as symbols, but as promises. The chaos of fractured rule of petty kings and rival temples began to recede. Order returned, not in a grand gesture, but in careful steps. Mentuhotep II moved the capital to Thebes, not just geographically, but spiritually. The southern city, once a regional power, now stood as the heart of a reunified Egypt. Its temples blossomed, its priests rose in rank, and its god, Amen, began a quiet ascent that would reshape Egyptian theology. For now, though, it was the legacy of stability that mattered most. Mentuhotep's reign ushered in the Middle Kingdom, a period often overlooked beside the grandeur of pyramids or the might of empire, yet one of the most refined, poetic, and introspective eras in Egypt's long story. Art changed. Perfection of the Old Kingdom gave way to realism, not harsh, but honest. Statues of pharaohs no longer portrayed only divine calm, but human concern. Faces were weary, eyes heavy with thought. Literature, too, flourished like papyrus in flood season. Works such as the Tale of Sinna and the Instruction of Amenhotep offered reflections on loyalty, mortality, betrayal, and fate. These were not hymns to gods, but meditations on what it meant to live in uncertain times. And still, the Nile flowed, and the people sowed. The 12th dynasty, following the 11th with quiet determination, brought some of the most capable rulers Egypt had ever known. Chief among them was Senuseret I, who reigned long and wisely. He strengthened borders, especially to the south, where Nubia's gold and trade routes beckoned. Fortresses rose along the Nile's cataracts, not only walls of defense, but statements of presence. Egypt is here, they said. This land is guarded. But more than soldiering, the Middle Kingdom was a time of building, not in scale, but in depth. Irrigation systems were repaired, temples expanded, administrative records meticulously kept. Fayum, a large oasis west of the Nile, saw canals and dams that turned marsh into arable land. Egypt was not reaching outward, it was healing inward. In the town of Alahan, Senusret II's pyramid rose modestly, not with the colossal ambition of Giza, but with practical wisdom. Nearby, villages for workers were laid out with planning and care, streets aligned, homes outfitted for function, even evidence of wages and bread rations. These were not slaves, they were citizens, paid laborers, contributors to a vision of national renewal. Religion, too, matured. The gods were no longer distant. Personal piety increased. Individuals sought relationships with deities beyond the formal rituals of temple priests. Amulets, prayers, and stele reflected a shift. Salvation was not just for kings. The god Osiris, once a mythic ruler of the dead, became central. To join Osiris in the afterlife became the common hope. And alongside Osiris, Amen, the hidden one grew in stature. In the vast complex at Karnak, temples to Ammon were expanded. Pillars rose like stone papyrus stalks. The scent of incense floated beneath high colonnades. Priests of Ammon gained power, slowly at first, but steadily. The religious landscape was shifting, aligning Thebes with both divine and earthly authority. But the Middle Kingdom was not without challenge. The deserts held dangers, the trade routes were long, and the balance between central control and local autonomy was always delicate. Senusret III, a strong-willed and fierce king, centralized power more than any before him. He curbed the influence of Namark's restructured bureaucracy, left behind fierce portraits with grim features, as if carved to reflect the weight of rule. His military campaigns pushed far into Nubia. He dug canals, left border markers, and ensured Egypt's southern frontier was both fortified and enriched. He may have also deified himself in life, a precursor to later divine kings. His successor, Amenhotep III, oversaw Egypt at its most stable. Trade flourished lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, ivory and incense from Punt. The Fayum reached peak fertility. His pyramid at Hawara, though mostly collapsed now, once held a labyrinth said by later Greeks to rival all wonders. And still, beneath this surface of order, the winds of change stirred. The 13th dynasty, which followed, saw a long line of short reigns. No cataclysm announced the Middle Kingdom's end. No drought, no invasion. It frayed slowly through overextension and administrative fatigue. Foreigners, especially from Western Asia, began settling in the Delta not as invaders, but as immigrants, traders, herders. Among them were the people who would later be called the Hyksos. But that is a story for another segment. For now we rest with the Middle Kingdom, that gentle bridge between the grandeur of the past and the challenges ahead. A time when Egypt listened more than it declared, when it pondered its purpose, shaped its soul, and wrote verses that still speak, soft and wise across the millennia. After the golden stillness of the Old Kingdom, where pyramids rose like hymns in stone and the Pharaoh's word coursed down the Nile like sunlight on water, Egypt began to tremble, not with violence at first, but with silence, hesitation, and the soft erosion of certainty. It didn't happen all at once. Collapse never does. There were still rituals, still offerings, still the rising of the sun over sacred temples, but the river began to whisper differently. For centuries, the Nile had obeyed a rhythm flooding with abundance and retreating to sour renewal. But something shifted. Whether it was the changing monsoon patterns far to the south, or cycles written in climate that no priest could predict, the floodwaters began to falter. One season, they came too low, the next too high, then not at all. The black silt that once fed the fields turned to dust, crops failed, grain prices soared, hunger sharpened into unrest. And beneath the surface of divine kingship, cracks began to form. The pyramids, now aging under the desert wind, stood watch over a country growing uncertain of its gods. For when the cosmic balance frayed, it was not only the poor who suffered. The divine authority of the pharaoh relied on order, on the presumption that Egypt was eternal and protected. When people starved, when tomb builders went unpaid, when nomarchs raised armies to secure their own storehouses, the illusion unraveled. By the end of the 6th dynasty, under the long and weary reign of Pepe II, who ruled perhaps into his 90s, central power waned into memory. Nomarchs, once regional administrators, became feudal lords in all but name. Some were benevolent, writing prayers for their people and maintaining temples. Others grew tyrannical, entrenching their families and waging petty wars with neighbors. Egypt, once united beneath the double crown, fractured into a mosaic of city-states, each wary of the other. The Great Pyramids no longer rose. Resources once dedicated to massive stoneworks now stayed local. Even tombs, once grand and timeless, shrank in scale and shifted in location. The desert reasserted its silence. From that silence came voices, not of gods, but of lament. The Apur Papyrus, one of the most haunting texts of ancient Egypt, survives from this period or reflects its aftermath. It tells of a world turned upside down. The rich are poor, the poor are rich, the dead are. Left unburied and chaos walks the streets. Though poetic and stylized, it speaks to a psychological truth that the first intermediate period was more than political collapse. It was a spiritual disorientation. The belief that the gods upheld justice, that the pharaoh stood between chaos and creation, that the rituals worked, all of it came under doubt. And yet, Egypt did not vanish. In the north, the city of Heracleopolis became a power center, asserting itself as the heir to Memphis and the Old Kingdom's legacy. In the south, Thebes began to rise modest at first, but growing in influence. Local rulers, called overseers of priests or simply kings in their own right, vied for power. They offered stability to their regions, promised the gods renewed temples, and kept records in stone to proclaim legitimacy. These rulers were not divine in the old way, but they were practical, resilient, and aware that memory mattered. Even in fragmentation, the scribes continued their work. They documented grants of land, cataloged temple inventories, and composed funerary texts for nobles who could no longer afford lavish tombs, but still longed for eternity. It is in this period that the coffin texts emerged, spells and prayers, inscribed not only for kings, but for anyone wealthy enough to prepare. Death had become democratic. The afterlife, once a royal privilege, was now a possibility for merchants, artisans, and priests. This change was profound. It meant that the collapse of centralized power didn't mean the collapse of faith. It evolved. People adapted. In Thebes, a line of rulers began to gather strength. Among them was Intef, whose modest tomb in the cliffs. Of western Thebes bears inscriptions of both military campaigns and reverent hymns to the gods. These kings, calling themselves the 11th dynasty, began pushing northward, reclaiming the concept of a unified Egypt. They were not conquerors in the brutal sense. They were restorers, seeking to heal the land's fractures. Battles were fought, yes, especially with the Heracleopolitan kings. But so too were alliances, marriages, and shared rituals. And slowly, the pendulum began to swing. Temples were rebuilt. Scribes copied ancient texts to preserve tradition. The old myths were retold with fresh emphasis. The tale of Osiris, dismembered and reassembled, held new meaning in a land seeking wholeness. In tomb paintings, the scenes of daily life returned, boating, baking, harvesting, not as nostalgic longing, but as hope. Egypt in its own quiet way was remembering how to be Egypt again. By the time Mentuhotep II ascended the throne in Thebes, the dream of unity was tangible. His reign would culminate in the reconquest of the north and the reestablishment of Thebes as capital A. Symbolic rebirth that echoed through temples and tombs alike. But that comes later. For now, we linger at the edge of this uneasy time, where drought starved not only the land, but the faith of a people. Where pyramids faded into memory, and where every prayer was a question. Will the river return? Will order rise again? The first intermediate period was not a fall into darkness, but a dusk filled with the flicker of stubborn light.
Ow.
And in that flicker, the seeds of renewal waited quiet, enduring, and patient as the desert. When we speak of ancient Egypt, when we close our eyes and picture sand and sun, and something vast and solemn under a pale blue sky, more often than not, what we see are pyramids, mute and massive, perfect in their silence. They seem eternal, as if the earth itself had folded upward in reverence. But there was a time when these monuments were not yet imagined. When the pharaohs still walked among low temples and mudbrick tombs, and power was no more than voice and gesture, that time was ending. And with the dawn of the Old Kingdom, something new stirred in the Egyptian soul, ambition, not loud or wild, but sacred, slow, measured in stone and symmetry. The third dynasty began this long awakening, and at its center stood a name still whispered in reverence, Djoser, reigned not just as pharaoh, but as a god incarnate. And it was during his rule that the concept of eternal architecture bloomed. Djoser turned to a man named Imhotep, a name that would echo through time not as myth, but as a rare historical figure so wise and talented he would later be deified. Imhotep was more than an architect. He was a priest, physician, astronomer, poet, scribe, a vessel of clarity in an age of sacred duty. Together, Djoser and Imhotep would reshape the Egyptian imagination. Until then, tombs were mastabas, rectangular, flat-roofed, modest. But Imhotep had a vision. What if, instead of building one tomb, they stacked them in steps? One mastaba atop another, 6 levels high. And so, on the Saqqara Plateau, the world's first pyramid was raised. The Step Pyramid, built not from mudbrick, but fine limestone, shimmered in the desert sun like a staircase to the afterlife. It wasn't just a tomb. It was a statement that the pharaoh, even in death, rose above all. Beneath it sprawled a complex of chapels, courtyards, temples, and corridors, each aligned to the stars, each meant to guide the soul through eternity. The Old Kingdom was just beginning, but already it had set its tone, permanence. As the Fourth Dynasty took the throne, that tone grew bolder. This was Egypt's golden age of pyramid building, an era of vast ambitions and the will to manifest them. Snefru, the dynasty's founder, experimented with form. His first attempt, the bent pyramid at Dashur, was a learning curve literally. Its angle changes midway, a visible scar of trial. Yet his red pyramid completed afterward stands today as one of the earliest true pyramids, smooth-sided and serene. These were not vanity projects. They were sacred duties. A pharaoh did not build for himself. He built for Mat, for the order that kept the stars aligned and the Nile flowing. And yet it was Snefru's son who would eclipse them all. Khufu, also known by the Greek name Cheops, at Giza, overlooking the Nile and facing the rising sun. He commissioned what would become the most enduring of all human monuments, the Great Pyramid. Over 2 million blocks of limestone, some weighing as much as a small elephant, were quarried, transported, and placed with such precision that modern engineers still marvel. No mortar, no machines, just vision, mathematics, and generations of labor. Beneath its golden capstone, now long gone, the pyramid once gleamed like a beacon, and within chambers spiraled upward, leading not to treasure, but to stillness. Khufu was followed by Kafir, who built the second Great Pyramid and, nearby, carved a guardian from living rock, the Sphinx. With its lion's body and human face, possibly his own, the Sphinx remains one of history's quietest enigmas. Weather-worn, stoic, and half-buried by time, it watches still. Menkaure, the third of the Great Pyramid builders, raised the smallest of the trio, but no less graceful. His reign marked the waning of pyramid grandeur, though not yet of royal power. During these reigns, Egypt was not just building monuments, it was building administration. The state expanded into something nearly bureaucratic. Overseers, scribes, and high priests gained importance. Viziers managed food stores, labor quotas, and taxation. The granaries of Egypt swelled. Art flourished, not wild or experimental, but serene and idealized. Statuary depicted not the chaos of life, but the stillness of the soul. Wall paintings showed daily work, harvesting, sailing, cooking, acts made sacred through repetition. And above it all, the pharaoh, radiant and serene, clasping symbols of authority. Yet for all this, the Old Kingdom's power had limits. The further from Memphis one traveled, the more local officials, nomarchs, governed as minor kings. Loyalty to the pharaoh was strong, but geography stretched unity thin. The first intermediate period would show the cost of that later. But for now, in this golden moment, Egypt hummed with cosmic order. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded. Temples opened each morning to awaken the gods, to bathe their statues, to feed them incense and song. In the high temples of Heliopolis, priests studied the sun and inscribed the earliest myths of creation. Adam, rising from the waters of chaos, creating himself, then all things. It was not just cosmology, it was identity. Egypt believed itself to be eternal because its gods were, and so its rulers built in stone, not to challenge time, but to greet it. And when each pharaoh passed, his pyramid anchored his soul, and the sun, glinting off white limestone, carried him skyward. The Old Kingdom, like the pyramids it raised, was serene and sharp. A kingdom ruled not by conquest, but by precision. And beneath the gaze of stone giants and the watchful sun, Egypt reached for eternity. And, for a moment, touched it. After the dust and disarray of the first intermediate period, Egypt did not simply awaken, it exhaled, long and low, like the breath of the Nile returning to its proper rhythm. The land had waited, its temples cracked, and its granaries hollow, but it had not forgotten. And neither had the gods, at least so the people hoped. With the rise of Mentuhotep II of Thebes, a ruler whose name meant the god Montu is satisfied, came the slow and deliberate stitching together of a divided nation. He wore the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, not just as symbols, but as promises. The chaos of fractured rule of petty kings and rival temples began to recede. Order returned, not in a grand gesture, but in careful steps. Mentuhotep II moved the capital to Thebes, not just geographically, but spiritually. The southern city, once a regional power, now stood as the heart of a reunified Egypt. Its temples blossomed, its priests rose in rank, and its god, Amen, began a quiet ascent that would reshape Egyptian theology. For now, though, it was the legacy of stability that mattered most. Mentuhotep's reign ushered in the Middle Kingdom, a period often overlooked beside the grandeur of pyramids or the might of empire, yet one of the most refined, poetic, and introspective eras in Egypt's long story. Art changed. Perfection of the Old Kingdom gave way to realism, not harsh, but honest. Statues of pharaohs no longer portrayed only divine calm, but human concern. Faces were weary, eyes heavy with thought. Literature, too, flourished like papyrus in flood season. Works such as the Tale of Sinna and the Instruction of Amenhotep offered reflections on loyalty, mortality, betrayal, and fate. These were not hymns to gods, but meditations on what it meant to live in uncertain times. And still, the Nile flowed, and the people sowed. The 12th dynasty, following the 11th with quiet determination, brought some of the most capable rulers Egypt had ever known. Chief among them was Senuseret I, who reigned long and wisely. He strengthened borders, especially to the south, where Nubia's golden trade routes beckoned. Fortresses rose along the Nile's cataracts, not only walls of defense, but statements of presence. Egypt is here, they said. This land is guarded. But more than soldiering, the Middle Kingdom was a time of building, not in scale, but in depth. Irrigation systems were repaired, temples expanded, administrative records meticulously kept. Fayum, a large oasis west of the Nile, saw canals and dams that turned marsh into arable land. Egypt was not reaching outward, it was healing inward. In the town of Alahan, Senusret II's pyramid rose modestly, not with the colossal ambition of Giza, but with practical wisdom. Nearby, villages for workers were laid out with planning and care, streets aligned, homes outfitted for function, even evidence of wages and bread rations. These were not slaves, they were citizens, paid laborers, contributors to a vision of national renewal. Religion, too, matured. The gods were no longer distant. Personal piety increased. Individuals sought relationships with deities beyond the formal rituals of temple priests. Amulets, prayers, and stele reflected a shift. Salvation was not just for kings. The god Osiris, once a mythic ruler of the dead, became central. To join Osiris in the afterlife became the common hope. And alongside Osiris, Amen, the hidden one grew in stature. In the vast complex at Karnak, temples to Ammon were expanded. Pillars rose like stone papyrus stalks. The scent of incense floated beneath high colonnades. Priests of Ammon gained power, slowly at first, but steadily. The religious landscape was shifting, aligning Thebes with both divine and earthly authority. But the Middle Kingdom was not without challenge. The deserts held dangers, the trade routes were long, and the balance between central control and local autonomy was always delicate. Senusret III, a strong-willed and fierce king, centralized power more than any before him. He curbed the influence of Namark's restructured bureaucracy, left behind fierce portraits with grim features, as if carved to reflect the weight of rule. His military campaigns pushed far into Nubia. He dug canals, left border markers, and ensured Egypt's southern frontier was both fortified and enriched. He may have also deified himself in life, a precursor to later divine kings. His successor, Amenhotep III, oversaw Egypt at its most stable. Trade flourished lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, ivory and incense from Punt. The Fayum reached peak fertility. His pyramid at Hawara, though mostly collapsed now, once held a labyrinth said by later Greeks to rival all wonders. And still, beneath this surface of order, the winds of change stirred. The 13th dynasty, which followed, saw a long line of short reigns. No cataclysm announced the Middle Kingdom's end. No drought, no invasion. It frayed slowly through overextension and administrative fatigue. Foreigners, especially from Western Asia, began settling in the Delta not as invaders, but as immigrants, traders, herders. Among them were the people who would later be called the Hyksos. But that is a story for another segment. For now we rest with the Middle Kingdom, that gentle bridge between the grandeur of the past and the challenges ahead. A time when Egypt listened more than it declared, when it pondered its purpose, shaped its soul, and wrote verses that still speak, soft and wise across the millennia. By the time the Middle Kingdom's final embers glowed faintly beneath the sands of time, Egypt had once again drifted into uncertainty, not with fire and fury, but with the slow erosion of structure, the gentle crumbling of bureaucratic walls. No great disaster heralded this new age. No tempest or foreign onslaught shattered the peace. Rather, the 13th dynasty stretched thin, like old parchment, and its many kings, perhaps dozens in rapid succession, flickered briefly and vanished, their names preserved more in lists than in lasting legacies. It was a time of fragmentation once again. Yet, as with all interludes in Egyptian history, collapse did not mean silence. The state's machinery continued, if haltingly. Scribes still inked ledgers, grains still flowed along canals, and temples held fast to rites that linked heaven and earth. But in the Delta, to the north, something new stirred foreigners, known collectively as the Hyksos, whose name would echo with both dread and misunderstanding. The Hyksos were not invaders in the sudden sense. They arrived gradually. Settlers from the Levant, traders, shepherds, warriors. Over time, their numbers grew, and so did their influence. They adopted Egyptian customs, spoke the language, worshipped familiar gods, but retained their own distinctions. Their chariots, their weapons, their names hinted at origins beyond the Sinai sands. As Egypt's central power faded, the Hyksos seized opportunity. They established control over the northern territories and founded their capital at Avaris, a thriving city built atop older Egyptian foundations. Here, amid bustling markets and fortified walls, a new kind of rulership emerged, part Egyptian, part Asiatic. Their kings took pharaonic titles, wore the crown, and claimed the blessing of the gods. But to the southern Egyptians, especially those in Thebes, these rulers were interlopers, pretenders. The tale of Hyksos' rule, though often painted in tones of invasion and suppression, was more complex. They did not raise temples or outlaw gods. In fact, many of them funded Egyptian-style monuments and partook in the traditions of divine kingship. Their reign marked not destruction, but adaptation, and yet their presence burned at the pride of Egypt's native elites. It was not merely foreignness that chafed, but the idea that the sacred order of the mat which tied king to cosmos could be so casually transferred. The 14th and 15th dynasties rose in parallel there, kings commanding little more than regional clout, yet preserving the idea of Egyptian sovereignty. Among these were the Theban kings of the 17th dynasty, modest in power, but rich in resolve. They were stewards of memory, guardians of tradition, and they waited. During this era, a curious blend of cultural hybridity marked the land. Avarice. Archaeological evidence shows palaces with Minoan frescoes, Levantan pottery, and Egyptian amulets in interweaving of worlds. Horses likely introduced or popularized by the Hyksos became part of Egypt's military landscape. Chariots, light, fast, deadly revolutionized warfare. Bronze weapons, composite bows, and foreign tactics seeped into Egypt's bones, preparing it, unknowingly, for a future of empire. But the simmering tension between native rule and Hyksos hegemony grew. In Thebes, a line of warlike rulers emerged. Seqenenre-Dao, a Theban king, died violently, his mummified skull bearing the marks of battle. His death, far from ending the resistance, became a rallying cry. His sons, Kamose and then Ahmose I, took up the mantle. Kamose launched daring raids northward, striking Hyksos strongholds and leaving inscriptions that echoed with pride, and Venemaze, young and determined, completed what his father and brother had begun. His campaigns drove the Hyksos from Avaris, pursued them into the Levant, and reasserted Egyptian rule across the land. This victory did more than end a dynasty. It marked the dawn of a new era, the new kingdom when Egypt, revitalized and militarized, would stretch its shadow far beyond its borders. But that, as always, is a tale for another time. For now, we remain in the quiet twilight between ages, in the time of foreign kings who wore Egyptian crowns, of dynasties remembered, more for their persistence than their glory. A time when Egypt absorbed and adapted, held its breath, and prepared once more to rise. When the last Hyksos chariot vanished beyond the eastern horizon, and the gates of Avaris were reclaimed, Egypt did not merely recover, it rebirthed itself with a clarity and ambition that had long slumbered beneath the dust of dynasties. The boy king, Ahmose, the first victor of the War of Liberation, was no mere soldier. He was the founder of the 18th dynasty, and with him began the new kingdom, a time when Egypt no longer looked inward in quiet restoration, but outward with vision sharpened. By centuries of fracture, this was Egypt at its golden hour, assertive, wealthy, culturally radiant. Thebes, now the undisputed capital, glistened with new temples, and the god Amen, long a local deity, now rose to supremacy in the pantheon. The priests of Amon became power brokers, stewards of ritual, and chroniclers of empire. At Karnak, the temple grew like a forest of stone, columns reaching skyward like petrified papyrus. The scribes inked histories on walls, not in the tone of supplication, but of celebration. Egypt had become the world's superpower, or as close to one as the ancient world allowed. Each successive pharaoh carried this mantle with differing strokes. Thutmose I expanded Egypt's borders into Nubia and as far north as the Euphrates, carving his name into the rocks of foreign lands like a tattoo across time. His daughter, Hatshepsut, would take an even more unique path. In a world that seldom made space for women in rule, Hatshepsut did not merely govern, she redefined kingship. She donned the false beard, stood alongside a man in temple reliefs, and commissioned one of the most breathtaking mortuary temples Egypt had ever seen at Deir el-Bahari. Her reign was not marked by conquest, but by art, architecture, and trade. Ships sailed to the mysterious land of Punt, returning with myrrh, ebony, gold, and exotic animals. Hatshepsut's Egypt was not just strong, it was elegant, yet history would try to erase her. Her successor, Thutmose III, a warrior king in his own right, had her images chiseled out, had her name omitted, her monuments obscured, and still, she endures. Thutmose III himself earned the title Napoleon of Egypt for his military campaigns. He led at least 17 recorded expeditions, bringing vassal states and tribute into Egypt's grasp. His reign epitomized the balance between martial prowess and domestic control. Under his rule, Egypt was at its most extensive, a crescent of influence stretching from modern Sudan to the edges of Mesopotamia. But the new kingdom was not all conquest, was deeply spiritual, increasingly complex, and filled with contradictions. The grandeur of Karnak was matched by the intimate tombs carved deep into the Valley of the Kings. It was here that the dead no longer reached for pyramids that scraped the sky, but descended into the earth, their stories painted along walls. In vivid blues and golds, the Book of the Dead, with its spells and judgment scenes, was not just for kings anymore. It had become the blueprint for eternal life, accessible to many who could afford it. And amid this glory came a crack, subtle at first, but seismic in hindsight. It came in the form of Amenhotep IV, better known to history as Akhenaten, abandoned Thebes, founded a new city called Akhetant, modern-day Amarna, and proclaimed that only one god, Aten, the sun disk, should be worshipped. The traditional gods, Amen foremost among them, were sidelined. Temples closed, priests dismissed. It was a spiritual revolution, and it unsettled the very core of Egyptian identity. Art changed to becoming naturalistic, almost alien. Akhenaten was shown with elongated limbs, swollen belly, and heavy features. His queen, Nefertiti, stood beside him, radiant and mysterious. Their daughters danced in sunbeams and carved reliefs. But despite its beauty and innovation, Amarna was built on sand. After Akhenaten's death, his son, a boy known as Tutankhaten, reversed the reforms, restoring Amen, returning to Thebes, and changing his name to Tutankhamen. His short reign was unremarkable, but his tomb, rediscovered in the 20th century, would become one of the most iconic archaeological finds in history. It's easy to forget that in his own time, he was but a whisper. The dynasty would stumble forward, increasingly dominated by powerful advisors and military officials. Horemheb, a general, ended the 18th dynasty with stern order. The 19th dynasty began with Ramses I, but it would be his grandson, Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, who would ascend as Egypt's most enduring symbol of majesty. Ramses II reigned for over 60 years. He built cities, temples, colossal statues. His face, serene and firm, adorned monuments across the land. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, a chaotic and indecisive clash immortalized as a great victory in temple reliefs. A peace treaty followed, one of the earliest known. He built Abu Simbel, carved into the cliffs of Nubia, its great statues seated in eternal watch. Inside, on certain days, sunlight pierced the temple's depths to illuminate the gods. Time, it seemed, had bowed to Ramses. But even golden hours must fade. Ramses II's successors struggled beneath the weight of his legacy. The priesthood of Amen grew too powerful. Economic strain, foreign incursions, and internal discord returned. The 20th dynasty, with Ramses III, would see flashes of old strength defeating the enigmatic sea peoples, but the decline had begun. The tombs of kings were looted even as their bodies cooled. Temples lacked funds. Pharaohs reigned briefly. Egypt, though still resplendent, had begun its long descent. But here, in the height of the new kingdom, we pause among the colossal statues. The sun-drenched courtyards, the scrolls of wisdom inked by candlelight. It was a time of splendor and contradiction, of ambition and art, of gods both old and newly born. The Nile flowed, as always, carrying the hopes of a people who believed more deeply than any other that memory was life, and to be remembered was to live forever. As the final embers of Egypt's golden age flickered in the twilight, a sense of solemn weariness settled over the land like desert dust. The mighty temples still stood, the gods still received offerings, and the sacred Nile still performed its ancient miracle of flooding and retreating, but the soul of the kingdom was fraying. The new kingdom, so triumphant under Thutmose, Hatshepsut, and Ramses, had begun to fracture from within. After the long and imposing reign of Ramses II, the line of succession became muddied, and each new pharaoh seemed smaller than the last. the weight of centuries pressed down upon them. Even Ramses III, who bravely repelled the mysterious sea peoples and maintained some flicker of grandeur, faced constant conspiracies from within his court. His death, as later revealed by forensic studies, came not from age or illness, but from betrayal, a slit throat, a whispered plot, a papyrus of vengeance. The priesthood of Ammon, once nurtured to glorify the divine kings, had grown into a state within a state. Their wealth was vast, their land holdings immense, and their influence unmatched. The pharaohs, nominally gods on earth, found themselves outmaneuvered in their own palaces. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were not just houses of worship, they were power centers, repositories of treasure, granaries of faith. In this spiritual shadow, the monarchy waned. The tombs of kings, once hidden deep in the valley of the kings and adorned with sacred texts to guide the soul, were violated, dropped, not by foreign invaders, but by those within. Even the once sacred mummies of pharaohs were displaced, moved, hurriedly by loyal priests, reburied in secret caches to protect them from desecration. In the city's economic strain tightened its grip. Trade networks shrank, craftsman guilds faltered, and bureaucratic efficiency collapsed. Grain was no longer plentiful. The once reliable flood patterns of the Nile became unpredictable. Famine, always feared, became familiar. The 21st and 22nd dynasties blurred together short-lived rulers. Often confined to Thebes or Tanis, ruled parallel regions in uneasy coexistence. Egypt was no longer united by a single divine authority, but split into competing factions. Even more curiously, some of these kings weren't warriors or nobles, but priests. High priests of Ammon took up royal titles, dressed in pharaonic garb, and held the crook and flail with solemn authority. The line between sacred and secular dissolved. Foreigners, too, became a fixture in Egyptian politics. Libyans, who had long settled in Egypt's western reaches, rose to prominence. They married into royal lines, commanded armies, and eventually ruled. The great Libyan kings like Shoshenq I attempted to rekindle Egypt's fading fire, even leading campaigns into QAnon and restoring faded temples. But these flashes of vitality were short-lived. Egypt had become reactive, not proactive. Its glory lived more in memory than in motion. Beyond its borders, new powers emerged. In the east, the Assyrians rose like a thunderstorm. Their king Ashurbanipal, Tiglath-Pileser, spoke not in hymns and ceremony, but in fire and conquest. They swept through the Levant, and in time even touched Egypt's soil. The once invincible land of the pharaohs became a prize, a client, state, a fading echo of its former majesty. In response, the 25th dynasty emerged not from Egypt, but from Kush, far to the south in Nubia. The Kushite kings, black Africans deeply influenced by Egyptian culture, believed themselves true heirs of the pharaohs. They marched north with reverence, not vengeance, restoring temples, respecting traditions, and proclaiming themselves as restorers of Mat. Pi, Taharka, and others led this Nubian renaissance, a final blooming of pharaonic dignity. The north bristled at their presence. The Assyrians returned, more brutal than before, sacking Thebes and humiliating Taharka's successors. The 26th dynasty, known as the Site period, tried one last time to bring unity and reform. Based in the northern city of Sais, these kings promoted learning, built new navy fleets, and fostered trade with Greece. For a time, it seemed Egypt might rise again not to imperial heights, but as a stable, dignified power. Samtakai and his lineage brought order, but not for long. Persia loomed on the horizon, and when Cambyses II crossed into Egypt, it was not as a curious visitor, but as a conqueror. In 525 BCE, Egypt fell under Persian rule. Pharaohs would return in name, but never again in the fullness of their ancient might. The land would trade hands between Persians, Greeks, and later Romans. Cleopatra, the last queen of the Ptolemaic line herself of Macedonian descent, would make one final, famous attempt to resist. But her story, and the shadow of Caesar and Antony, belong to another time. And so, as twilight deepens, we leave Egypt in a moment of sorrowful majesties, till draped in gold. Still whispering spells beneath temple columns, but no longer the beating heart of the ancient world. Sands would reclaim what time forgot. The stones would fall silent, but the memory would endure. Carved into papyrus, inked on walls, etched in the shape of the Nile itself. Egypt in decline remained eternal. As the final pages of ancient Egypt's long and winding chronicle fluttered closed, the sounds of her old gods still echoed faintly in the sanctuaries, but the world around her had changed beyond recognition. After centuries of glories and collapses, invasions and renaissances, the last dynasties of native pharaohs had passed into silence. In their place came men of foreign tongues and distant customs. First the Persians, and then, following the thunder of Alexander's conquests, the Greeks. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great rode triumphantly into Memphis. Hailed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator by those weary of Persian rule. The Macedonian commander, known more for war than worship, understood something profound about Egypt's. Soul ran deep through its rituals, temples, and myths, and so he bowed before the gods, respected the priesthood, and allowed Egypt to dream briefly of restored divinity. He founded a city Alexandria upon the Mediterranean shore, and though he would never return to it in life, it would grow to become Egypt's most dazzling jewel in the Hellenistic world. Upon Alexander's sudden death, his vast empire fractured, and Egypt fell into the hands of one of his generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagus. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek-speaking pharaohs, who would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, blending Hellenistic refinement with Egyptian grandeur. These rulers wore the double crown, appeared in temples carved like the old kings, and were mummified upon death. But theirs was a kingdom of mirrors, Greek in administration, Egyptian in appearance, often more cosmopolitan than sacred. The capital, Alexandria, gleamed with intellectual fire. The great library of Alexandria, that mythical treasury of human thought, stood at the heart of the city, drawing scholars from every known land. Philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and poetry blossomed within its walls, where scrolls stretched. In the thousands and whispers of forgotten languages hung in the air, the city housed the towering lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships and scholars alike to its harbor. And yet, for all its brilliance, Alexandria was not Thebes, and the Ptolemies were not divine in the way the old kings had been. Still, Egypt endured. Its festivals continued. Its temples still rang with hymns. Its farmers still sowed and reaped by the rhythm of the Nile. Some of the later Ptolemies even attempted a revival of sorts, building temples in the ancient style. The Temple of Horus at Edfu and the Temple of Isis at Philae rose in stone tribute to the gods, their walls etched with hieroglyphs and myths as if nothing had changed. But the world had moved on. Rome was rising. Its legions spread like wind-blown fire across the Mediterranean, and soon the Republic-turned-empire turned its eyes toward Egypt. Caught in the storm of politics and power plays was Cleopatra VII last. Of the Ptolemies, fluent in many languages, student of philosophy, and more Egyptian in spirit than many of her ancestors. Her reign was marked by calculated alliances and famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. She sought to preserve Egypt's independence through wit and seduction, strength and spectacle. But her enemies were not superstitious. Kings or fractious provinces, they were the calculating architects of empire. In 30 BCE, following defeat at the Battle of Actium and Antony's death, Cleopatra, sensing the end, took her own life, wrapped in legend, perhaps by asp's bite, perhaps otherwise. With her death, Egypt was folded into the Roman Empire, no longer a kingdom, but a province. The last pharaoh had fallen. Still, the old ways lingered. Even under Roman rule, the temples of Isis and Horus were tended. Priests walked their sacred paths. Mummification continued, now mingled with Greco-Roman artistry. But time eroded faith. As Christianity spread across the empire, the old gods lost their voice. The temples grew quiet, the scribes disappeared, and the hieroglyph sacred writing of the gods faded into unreadable mystery. In 391 CE, Theodosius I issued a decree banning pagan practices. The Temple of Isis at Philae, once a glowing beacon of devotion, held out for a few more decades until it, too, fell silent in the 6th century. And so the last light of ancient Egyptian religion was extinguished. The colossal statues, the sanctuaries, hidden in stone, the painted tombs beneath the sands all slipped into dream. For 1,000 years, Egypt became a land of relics, its past half remembered, its monuments broken or buried. But it was never truly forgotten. Arab historians wrote of pyramids. Medieval pilgrims wondered at the Sphinx. Napoleon's scholars, centuries later, would copy its symbols, and a single stone, the Rosetta Stone, would crack the code. With it, the voices of the past rose again. Prayers, the laws, the poetry inscribed in silent symbols were heard once more.
No.
And so, Egypt did not die. Its gods may have vanished from the altars, but they lived in stone and memory, in the bend of the Nile, and the shimmer of heat on distant dunes. The story of ancient Egypt, from Narmer's unification to Cleopatra's defiance, did not end it. Drifted softly into legend, into dreams, into the quiet, endless night. And so, with the fall of Cleopatra and the fading chants from the last temple sanctuaries, ancient Egypt slipped not into death, but into slumber. Deep, patient silence stretched across centuries as the great stone faces gazed across the sands and waited. The winds whispered over the Nile, now watched not by priests and pharaohs, but by foreign governors, merchants, missionaries, and pilgrims who walked in the shadows of ruins they did not fully understand. Dust cloaked the statues, sand filled the tombs, and slowly the memory of Egypt's grandeur softened into legend. The language was lost, the rituals forgotten, and even the gods themselves became nothing more than figures in Greek and Roman imagination. Horus, Anubis, Isis, and Thothwans, vibrant forces of life and law, became mere curiosities in old texts, yet still the monuments remained. The pyramids rose defiantly above the plateau at Giza, enduring flood and famine, war and weather. And the Sphinx, its nose shattered by time or cannon fire, watched silently as empires came and went. When Arab armies arrived in the 7th century CE, they brought new faith and a different tongue. They too were awed by the ancient works, and gave the pyramids names, wrote of their majesty, and pondered their mysteries. But the knowledge of how and why these wonders were built had vanished like morning mist. For over a millennium, Egypt remained a land layered in forgetfulness, a living country draped in a shroud of its own past. European travelers in the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras returned home with stories of strange statues, labyrinthine ruins, and tombs half buried in the sand. Artists painted the Sphinx in exaggerated forms. Writers filled their pages with dreams of mummies and pharaohs. But none truly knew the truth of Egypt, not yet. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a new energy to the land. When Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Egypt in 1798, he brought not just soldiers, but scholars. Dozens of savants, engineers, geographers, linguists, and artists descended on temples and tombs with measuring rods and ink pens. Copying inscriptions and sketching colossi, their findings would fill massive volumes law. Description deleged a landmark work that introduced Europe to a version of Egypt still cloaked in mystery, but now documented with care. And then came the discovery that changed everything. In 1799, near the town of Rosetta, a black basalt slab was unearthed by French soldiers. Etched upon it were 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, the Rosetta Stone. It would take decades, but eventually, thanks to the tireless work of Jean-Francois Champollion, the hieroglyphic script lost for 1,400 years was deciphered. The silence of Egypt cracked open. The priests and scribes spoke. Again, their prayers, their tax records, their laws, and poems came back to life. The past no longer slumbered. It stirred. Archaeologists soon followed in greater numbers, sweeping through the Valley of the Kings and the sands of Saqqara. Giovanni Belzoni, a flamboyant strongman turned explorer, dragged massive statues from temple ruins. Flinders Petrie brought scientific discipline to the field. And in 1922, the world was transfixed when Howard Carter uncovered the intact tomb of a minor King Tutankhamun. The boy king, buried in a glittering chamber filled with gold, daggers, chariots, and sacred texts, ignited a global fascination with Egypt that has never truly faded. But the rediscovery of ancient Egypt was not without its shadows. Colonial powers removed countless artifacts, now displayed in distant museums. Mummies were unwrapped in public theaters. Sacred tombs were looted in the name of science. Egypt, once silent, now spoke again, but often through the mouths of others. In the 20th century, as Egypt regained its independence and identity, the country began reclaiming its heritage. The temples at Abu Simbel were saved from flooding by international cooperation, moved stone by stone to higher ground. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo became a sanctuary for relics once buried in darkness. The stories were no longer just about what foreigners had found, but about what Egypt remembered. And yet, even with all we have uncovered, there is so much we do not know. Beneath the sands lie more secrets, lost tombs, undiscovered texts, forgotten names. The Egyptians, ever conscious of eternity, hid their truths well. Even now, as satellites scan the desert and ground-penetrating radar peers beneath the stones, we continue to unearth new pieces of the story. Egypt does not age in the way other civilizations do. It feels timeless, eternal, wrapped in layers of myth and monument. It lives in the lines of papyri, in the eyes of statues, in the grooves of temple walls. For centuries, it slept beneath sand and silence. But now it whispers again, carried by the wind across the Nile. And as you drift to sleep, know that somewhere in the darkness of a hidden chamber, a golden face still waits, and the name of a long-dead scribe remains inked in faded symbols, untouched by time. Egypt sleeps but never truly dies.